Welcome to Cardozo Law School. I just want to, first of all, on behalf of the Center for Jewish Law and Contemporary Civilization, welcome both the panelists, participants of what is otherwise a closed conference on the Divine Courtroom in Comparative Perspective, and the more general public who are participating in the one session of the conference which is open to the public, and that is this evening's panel, this afternoon's panel, on Agents of the Divine, Reflections on Judicial, Papal, and Rabbinic Infallibility. Let me just try to contextualize the panel a little bit in light of the themes of the conference of which it's a part. We conceived of this panel in terms of the general theme of the conference, which is the divine courtroom, in various traditions, and the framework for the panel is indicated by its title, that is Agents of the Divine, Reflections on Judicial, Papal, and Rabbinic Infallibility. And the questions that our three distinguished panelists will address this afternoon are roughly as follows. What is the basis for the view that human authorities are infallible? Is there some way in which a doctrine of infallibility is shaped by a view of judges, popes, and rabbis as possessing divinely endowed authority, as in some way drawing upon God's infallibility? Does infallibility indicate that these figures are viewed as representatives for, or even embodiments of, God? On the other hand, what exactly are the arguments offered by the opponents of infallibility? Are they theological in nature, denying the possibility of divine presence in human decisors, or are they instead political in nature? In the American constitutional context, the question would be whether the view of judicial infallibility resembles in its structure and foundation the similar doctrine in the religious context, whether, even more interestingly, the image of the judge in the American imagination is shaped by religious conceptions, a view that we might characterize as political theology, or whether, in the end, the possibility of judicial infallibility in the secular context should be distinguished from its counterpart in the religious context. Put simply, and in terms of the famous line articulated by Justice Jackson, are the decisions of the Supreme Court final because the justices are infallible, or are those decisions infallible because they are final? And if the latter, why are they infallible? We'll reserve the comparative aspects of the panel for a roundtable discussion which will follow the three presentations. And now I'm going to turn the panel over to our distinguished moderator, Professor Arthur Jacobson of Cardozo Law School.
My job as moderator is to get out of the way as quickly as possible, so that's what I'm going to do. I'd first like to introduce Professor Kenneth Parker from St. Louis University, who will give his paper titled "A Perpetual Doctrine Tested by a Perpetual Rule Needs a Perpetual Judge: Papal Authority and the Infallibility Debates of 19th Century Roman Catholicism." Oh, we can repair to the...
we have to go to, to go and see. Do we just, PowerPoints. Right. We should give the audience too.
Right. Well, I want to thank the organizers of this conference. This is a fascinating subject and one that I find myself interested in for a variety of reasons. I'm not only a specialist in 19th century Roman Catholicism, doing work on papal infallibility, but I'm the director of the St. Louis University prison program. And so my work with people in the prison system often brings me to these sorts of issues, especially given the fact that I work with men who have committed murder and other kinds of violent crimes. But I'm here tonight, or this afternoon, to talk about papal infallibility. The quote that makes up the title of my talk is actually drawn from the writings of Henry Manning, the Archbishop of Westminster in England in the 19th century. He was actually a convert to Roman Catholicism, and in 14 very short years, he went from being an Anglican archdeacon to being the primate, effectively, of the English-speaking world for Roman Catholicism. And he had a very interesting and, one might argue, innovative understanding of papal infallibility that was to dominate Roman Catholic discourse really over the last 140 years. Now, the thesis of my presentation is stated in this slide. The marginalization of the collegial authority of bishops, the collective authority of bishops, has, in favor of an infallible papal judge of truth, has marked Roman Catholicism for more than 140 years, creating a tension between the claims of an ultimate, divinely ordained earthly authority by popes and the Curia and many others in the church, and the need to respond to rapidly changing religious and cultural circumstances in the 20th century and in the 21st century. Now, the scene that you see here in this iconographic representation is of the First Vatican Council, which happened in 1870. And as you can see, it very effectively represents what a group known as the Neo-Ultramontanes believed, that there was a sense in which the authority of the Pope was directly received from Christ, that he had, as Professor Fines pointed out, in this imagery that's very architectural, a kind of divinely ordained place, judging and deciding on truth claims. Now, there were three contentious points in the definition of papal infallibility known as Pastor Aeternus that was passed on the 18th of July, 1870. And here are the three contentious points. First, that papal infallibility is associated with or actually equated with the infallibility of the Church. Second, that it's not reformable by bishops and council. And third, that papal infallible statements do not require the consent of bishops and council or their assent when dispersed. These are very important points for the talk as I move forward. So I want you to be conscious of these 3 points because we're going to go back for background information. Now, there are 2 theories of papal authority that dominate Roman Catholic discourse about the authority of the Pope. And these, very roughly, if there are scholars who are specialists in this field, they'll know that I'm grossly oversimplifying, but for the sake of this presentation, there are 2 primary theories that we need to keep in mind. One is called Ultramontanism, that emphasizes papal supremacy. It's a very monarchical understanding of papal authority. And the second is Gallicanism. There are many national permutations of this: Febronianism, Josephinism, British Gallicanism. I've even come up with a term called Gaelic Gallicanism to talk about the Irish version of this. But simplified to its basic points, Gallicanism emphasizes the role of bishops and the rights of local churches. So please keep that in mind. Now, Ultramontane theory, what is it? In Ultramontane theory, papal authority is the center of unity. The Pope is the arbiter of disputes. He's the conserver of the ancient faith. He cannot add to it. It's inextricably connected with episcopal consensus, meaning he and the bishops have to agree in order for something to be infallible. And these infallible statements are limited to ex cathedra judgments, meaning the Pope sitting on the throne of St. Peter makes a judgment. And the Pope has to be very explicit in stating this. Only ex cathedra judgments were considered to be infallible, but they had to be confirmed by bishops, either in council or dispersed throughout the world. I'm sorry. I seem to be being pushed along. What papal authority is not the individual opinion of the man on the papal throne, and it is not the caprice of the chief pastor, the Pope, as an individual. So, what is the limitation of the Pope? Probably one of the most interesting examples of this is the response that was given by Joseph de Maistre in Du Pape. His answer, he's a famous ultramontane in 1819, he says everything constrains the Pope. Canons, laws, national usages, sovereigns, tribunals, national assemblies, prescriptions, representations, negotiations, duty, fear, prudence, and especially public opinion, the queen of the world. Interesting. But it's also important to emphasize that the Pope was understood to be judging what was first and true. Probably the most famous ultramontane here in the United States, Francis Kenrick. You're going to hear about another Kenrick a little bit later, but Francis Kenrick, Archbishop of Baltimore, in one of his writings praised Tertullian's axiom that, quote, whatever is first is true, and whatever is more recent is spurious. He emphasized that only the successor of St. Peter could be the competent judge of what is first and true. Now, Gallican theory. Gallican theory shared much common ground with ultramontanes. Gallicans also emphasized that the Pope was the center of unity, the arbiter of disputes, the conserver of the apostolic faith. He couldn't add to it. Through his blessing, councils were valid, and their judgments were determined to be infallible, and his decrees were infallible with the consent of the bishops. Important point to emphasize. Gallican theory established certain essential limitations on papal authority. Kings were not subject to the Pope. General councils superseded the Pope's authority. In other words, during periods of controversy, it was councils that decided, finally, not popes. And popes must respect the local customs of churches around the world. Papal decrees did not bind unless they were accepted by the whole church. So a teaching of the Pope had to be received by all of the church in order for it to be infallible. In Gallican theory, a very interesting observation made by the president of Maynooth, the seminary in Ireland, Crotty made the observation, it is an error to believe that the Pope, speaking of himself and separate from a general council, is infallible. This absurd opinion is evidently false and generally rejected even as an opinion. This is in 1826. However, it's very interesting that when posed with the question, another Gallican made the observation that if a pope and a council agreed together and declared the Pope infallible, it would be a binding article of faith on all Catholics. Now, there was such a shift that occurred in the 1850s and 1860s. There was the beginnings of a new movement that scholars call neo-ultramontanism. This neo-ultramontanist thought emphasized that the church is a society of faithful governed by the Pope. In other words, a shift from the notion of the bishops being together and agreeing together with the Pope as the head, to the Pope being the universal bishop of the entire church, and all bishops being, in some sense, essentially subordinate to him. Papal infallibility was argued by ultramontanes to be not dependent on the consent of bishops and council. Papal infallibility extended beyond ex cathedra definitions of dogma to other forms of teaching by the Pope. And it was even argued that the Pope has special inspiration, that he spoke in some sense for God, and that the Pope was impeccable and sinless. This was one of the arguments made by neo-ultramontanes. Now, it became even more bizarre as we moved into the later 1850s and 1860s. We had a Swiss bishop stating that the Pope was the third incarnation of God the Son. God in the womb, God in the Virgin, Christ in the Eucharist, and God the Son in the Vatican. So he was even treated as an incarnation of Jesus Christ. We have another French bishop describing the Pope as the continued presence of the incarnate Word, Christ, on earth. And in the 1860s, neo-ultramontanes who were a part of the Curia even went so far as to revise breviary prayers addressing supplications to the living Pope, to Pius IX. In 1854, we have the beginnings of an effort to really identify a precedent for arguing that the Pope, speaking in his own authority, being infallible. And that was the declaration of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception of Mary. And this is understood commonly to be the first papal ex cathedra definition apart from a council. Now, this was celebrated about a decade later in a French journal, which argued that Louis XIV's famous expression, "L'État c'est moi," this "I am the state," was actually something that Pius IX could claim about the Church, because he could say with greater authority that he had said with his actions, "I am the Church." Speaking in his own authority, he was saying, I speak for the Church. I am the Church. Now, when we think about the First Vatican Council, we think of a scene like this one, very tranquil, very stately, and the opening scenes from the First Vatican Council, December the 8th, 1869, look very, very stately, very calm, very tranquil. The feast day, the 8th of December, is the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, so there's a intentional tie to that first ex cathedra pronouncement by a pope. But let's look at the historical context of 1869, 1870. We have Bismarck seeking to unify Germany. Napoleon III is struggling to maintain French monarchy. Garibaldi is campaigning and is on the verge of unifying Italy. And the Pope is fighting to retain the remnant of the Papal States with French troops. And here we see what St. Peter's Square looks like in April of 1870. 20,000 French troops massed in the square to protect the Pope and the Council from Garibaldi and the Italian nationalists. Now, you can imagine in that kind of context that the Archbishop from the town that I come from, St. Louis, was understandably under a bit of pressure when he came forward and quite vigorously, as a leader of the minority, what became known as the minority bishops, condemned what he considered to be innovative ideas introduced at the council. These ideas, he argued, set up conflict between the Pope and bishops, that the Pope was infallible with the consent of the bishops, and the Pope is not infallible apart from the bishops. As we can see, there was agreement about that just a few decades before. Now, by May and early June, the minority bishops were being further pushed to the edges of conciliar considerations. They were being attacked in the council, and in June the 2nd, the majority maneuvered to close debate on the draft of Pastor Aeternus. This meant that Archbishop Peter Kenrick, remember Francis was his older brother and was a great apologist for papal supremacy, but a moderate ultramontane. Here we have Kenrick essentially arguing the same things as his older brother, but finding himself being harshly criticized. His greatest concern was that the elevation of papal supremacy and power to the detriment of episcopal authority diminished the authority of both. And he went on to state that, I'm sorry, something's happening with my slides. He went on to state that in his harsh attack on Henry Manning, that Henry Manning, although he had no doubt about the infallibility of the Pope, personal, separate, and absolute, that he was wanting to force this view, this opinion, on the entire church. Now, Kenrick stated very boldly, I declare that this opinion is not a doctrine of the faith and that it cannot become such by any definition whatever, even by the definition of a council. Now, in America, in the Freeman's Journal, Kenrick was harshly criticized, and these propositions that were agreed, points of agreement between ultramontanes and Gallicans just a few decades before, were described as propositions that are accounted scandalous, proximate to heresy, or absolutely heretical. However, we have to point out that Kenrick and the minority bishops were successful in forcing the majority to qualify papal infallibility and what they meant by personal, separate, and absolute. On the 11th of July, 1870, Archbishop Gassier made a very lengthy presentation, a 4-hour presentation in Latin to the council. And he answered these questions in some detail. But they basically boil down to this. The Pope's infallibility personal? It's personal in the sense that it belongs to the Roman pontiff, not to the church and not to the Roman see. It is not personal as the Pope speaking as a private person or as a private doctor. In what way is it separate? It's separate because of a special promise made to St. Peter in the Gospel of Luke. But the point that Gassier emphasized was that the Pope can no more be separated from the church than the foundation can be separated from a building it bears. In what sense is the Pope's authority absolute? Here, Gassier was emphatic. It in no way is the Pope's infallibility absolute, because absolute infallibility belongs only to God. But he said that there is no strict and absolute necessity. This is how he twists the word. He said there's no absolute necessity for bishops to assent to dogmatic definitions by a pope. Now, in the preliminary vote on the 13th of July, 1870, fully 33% of the council dissented in some form, either by absence, by voting against it, or by voting yes with reservations. The following 5 days later, 25% of the council fathers left Rome before the final vote. 55 signed a letter of protest before leaving. And while the actual vote was virtually unanimous, you can see that there was hardly what was understood to be a necessity, moral unanimity on the part of bishops and council on a definition. Historical context following the vote is really quite interesting. The day after the vote was taken, France declared war on Prussia. A little over a week later, the French troops withdrew from Rome. And less than 2 months later, the Pope was a self-declared prisoner of the Vatican. He no longer had his papal states because Italian troops occupied the city, and the papal states were no more. Now, the fears of the minority bishops were the following. First, they were afraid that neo-ultramontanes would succeed in branding advocates for the role of bishops with the taint of heresy. They were also concerned that the interpretation of papal infallibility would be made much more broadly than the documents allowed, and that they would promote devotion to the papacy that implied personal impeccability of the Pope as universal bishop, and a maximalist infallibility. Now, John Henry Newman, when pressed by one of his disciples about this, responded with the following quote, and this is worth quoting. Looking at early history, it would seem as if the church councils moved on to perfect truth by various successive declarations, alternately in contradictory directions, and thus perfecting, completing, and supplying each other. Let us have a little faith in her, the church, I say. Pius is not the last of the popes. Let us be patient. Let us have faith, and a new pope and a reassembled council may trim the boat. Well, the fears of the minority were realized. Critics of papal supremacy and infallibility and advocates for bishops were tainted with heresy in the early 20th century. The definition of papal infallibility was interpreted more broadly than the text of the dogma allowed, and devotion to the Pope's personal impeccability, universal authority, and absolute infallibility was encouraged. The last, perhaps, high point of papal infallibility in the 20th century was the second ex cathedra definition of dogma in 1950 by Pius XII, when he defined the dogma of the Assumption of Mary. But just a little over a decade later, the Second Vatican Council occurred, a new pope and reassembled council. And that council produced documents that emphasized the collegiality of bishops, with the Pope as the center of unity. It emphasized the integrity of local national churches, and it also stressed the importance of subsidiarity, the preference for decentralized decision-making. However, you can see the image of the future Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, both present at the council, and John Paul II as a council father, Benedict XVI, Cardinal Ratzinger, Joseph Ratzinger as a theologian at that time. Those latter two figures were concerned about the emphasis of the council, and in their pontificates have made it an effort to reverse or to bring back into what they consider to be balance issues around the subject. Now, I'll just raise a couple of points before I finish up. We have two examples of contested papal teaching that have been argued to be infallible. Humanae Vitae in 1968, the document that continued the ban on artificial contraception. And in 1994, John Paul II's letter, Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, in which the Pope declared that women cannot and never will be priests. These are contested questions, but questions around which papal authority and papal infallibility are being argued. The contemporary debate in Roman Catholic circles now is the infallibility of the ordinary magisterium, non-ex cathedra documents, creeping infallibilism or development of doctrine? And may Catholics question non-ex cathedra pronouncements of the Pope and Vatican officials? And if so, under what conditions should this be done? I'll stop there.
I'd like to thank Professor Parker for that magisterial presentation. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Lawrence Kaplan from McGill. He'll be talking about a paper entitled, "Even If They Tell You That Left is Right and Right is Left, Listen to Them. The Multiple Roots and Functions of Da'as Torah." Professor Kaplan.
Thanks very much. I think you said Dat Torah, and I deliberately wrote Das Torah. So
I said Das.
you did? Okay, I'm sorry. There's a handout. So the handout basically is an outline of the paper. You can sort of follow along. Some parts I spell out in more detail, some in less detail. The main point is I try to have like the major quotes there so you can follow along. I was going to say that after the PowerPoint presentation, which was high-tech, but I realize it's not high-tech, but by my standards, it's high-tech. So you're going to have this low-tech handout, as though you could sort of follow along. On Saturday night, November 26, 2011, at the recent annual convention of Agudas Yisrael, the leading organization of Haredi, that is traditional non-Zionist orthodoxy in the United States, the noted Agudas spokesman, Rabbi Shimshon Scherer, rabbi of Kahal Zichron Mordechai of Flatbush, and son of the late famous and universally admired Aguda leader, the president of Aguda, Rabbi Moshe Scherer, declared in an impassioned speech, and I'm quoting, you don't have that actually, "Let it be said very clearly, total subjugation to Torah, total subservience to Das Torah is divinely ordained." So here we have it in a nutshell. Das Torah is on the same level as Torah, and total subservience to Das Torah is as divinely ordained as total subjugation to Torah. What then is Das Torah, and why has it been in the news as of late? This paper will examine the multiple roots and functions of Das Torah. Here you can follow along. Das Torah is a theory of rabbinic authority currently espoused by the Haredi community, consisting of a premise and a conclusion. The premise, to cite Rabbi Bernard Weinberger, a 20th century American Haredi spokesman, is that the Gedolei Yisrael, the great rabbinic scholars of each generation, I'm quoting, you have it there, possess a special endowment to penetrate objective reality and apply the pertinent halachic principles. This is a form of Ruach HaKodesh, literally the Holy Spirit, divine inspiration, bordering, if only remotely, on the periphery of prophecy, sort of hedging his bets, a form of bordering, but still using the terms divine inspiration and some idea of prophecy. From this premise, the conclusion follows that the Gedolei Yisrael, these great rabbinic giants, are uniquely qualified to express the authoritative Torah view and consequently ought to be the final arbiters on all aspects of Jewish public policy and matters of hashkafa and worldview affecting the community as a whole. They admit, on local issues, it's okay for community rabbis. But the big issues, the Gedolei Yisrael, and their views are beyond criticism. If this theory does not directly ascribe infallibility to the Gedolim, it renders them functionally infallible. In a paper I wrote some 20 years ago, I referred to Das Torah as, that was a subtitle of my paper, a modern conception of rabbinic authority. A Haredi critic of my article, Rabbi Beryl Wien, argued, actually Rabbi Wien, by the way, since he's moved to Israel afterwards, he's been much more critical of Haredi community because he sees what it's really like in Israel. But that's a separate issue. Okay. I have enough editorializing in the body of my talk, so maybe. Okay. A Haredi critic, Rabbi Beryl Wien, argued that Das Torah, far from being a modern conception of rabbinic authority, is, quote, an ancient definition of authority and responsibility. In support of this claim, Haredim generally cite 4 traditional sources, which in their view undergird Das Torah. First and foremost, Lo Tasur, you shall not deviate. Second, the Emunat Chachamim, faith in the sages. Third, the Chol Avah, that all is contained in the Torah. And fourth and last, Malchut, kingship. I'll focus on Lo Tasur, you shall not deviate, first because it is the most central and important source, and second because it raises 2 important issues. The issue of the relationship between finality and fallibility in rabbinic decision-making, about which we already heard from Professor Mermelstein. That issue is applied to the context of the Supreme Court. We'll hear more about it from Professor Burt. And the issue of the institutionalization as opposed to the de-institutionalization of rabbinic authority. So Lo Tasur refers to the verse in Deuteronomy 17:11. You have the text with you in the handout. You shall not deviate from the verdict that they, according to the rabbinic understanding, it means the great court, announced to you either to the left or to the right. Haredim place particular stress on the Sifrei, the Tannaitic Midrash on Deuteronomy, in the version cited by Rashi in his commentary on the verse. That's the title of my paper. Even if they tell you that left is right and right is left, listen to them. They further note that the great commentator Nachmanides, in his commentary on this verse, offers as a second explanation for this law, I quote, "For God's Spirit is upon the ministers of his sanctuary, that they are preserved from error and stumbling." Here we have the view that the great court, the Sanhedrin, is final because it is infallible. Precisely the reverse of the famous view expressed by Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, already referred to by Professor Mermelstein, that the Supreme Court is not final because it is infallible, but it is infallible only because it is final. While Nachmanides, as do most authorities, limits this grant of authority, much less the preservation from error, to the great court, and indeed to the great court only when it meets in the sanctuary, where the divine presence is to be found, as his comment makes clear. A Haredim note that the 14th century anonymous author of the Sefer HaChinuch deinstitutionalizes this grant of rabbinic authority, extending the positive commandment to heed all the great courts which will arise, to include the outstanding rabbinic scholars and judges of our day, and conversely, the negative commandment, again, same thing, not to disobey the charge of the great court, again, extending it to the earlier sages and outstanding rabbinic scholars of our day. This Haredi use of Lo Tasur as a traditional source for the doctrine of Das Torah is, in my view, problematic. First, the view of the Sifrei would appear to be contradicted by an interpretation of the verse offered in the Yerushalmi Horayot. One might think that if they tell you that left is right and right is left, you must listen to them. Therefore, the verse tells us to go to the left or to the right until they tell you that right is right and left is left. Many authorities attempt to harmonize the Sifrei and the Yerushalmi, while others assume that they are simply contradictory. We don't really have time to go into this. Let us, however, for argument's sake, set aside the Yerushalmi and focus on the Sifrei. Even so, the view of the Sefer HaChinuch, extending the grant of authority containing the prohibition of Lo Tasur, as understood by the Sifrei from the Great Court, which is no longer in existence, to the outstanding rabbinic scholars of our day, the key linchpin of the Haredi argument is, as already indicated, a minority view. Not to mention the practical issue of who is it, according to the Sefer HaChinuch, that determines who are the outstanding rabbinic scholars and judges of our day. Moreover, the classic authorities limit this grant of authority to matters of halacha, Jewish law, either to laws concerning the meaning of the Torah, which is the view of Nachmanides, or to laws derived through the 13 hermeneutic principles, and even to rabbinic decrees and ordinances, the view of Maimonides and most authorities. It's only the ideology of Das Torah that extends this grant of authority to matters of hashkafa, so worldview and public policy. I'd like to take a closer look at Nachmanides' view, for it raises the key issue of the relationship between finality and infallibility. As indicated earlier, Nachmanides in his commentary on Deuteronomy 17:11 offers as his second explanation for lo tasur, for God's Spirit is upon the ministers of a sanctuary, that they are preserved from error and stumbling. Here, as already noted, the great court is final because it is infallible. Nachmanides' first explanation, however, is, you can follow along here. The import is, even if you think they are wrong, and the matter is obvious to you as your ability to distinguish between right and left, follow their commandments, and say, thus I was commanded by God, who enjoined the commandments, that I should perform all his commandments in accordance with all that they who stand before him in the place that he shall choose. Again, emphasis on the sanctuary, shall teach me. And it is on the basis of their understanding of its meaning that he gave me the Torah, even if they are mistaken. And the need for this commandment is very great, for the Torah was given to us in written form, and it is known that not all views will be in agreement regarding newly arising matters. Thus disputes will multiply, and one Torah will become many Torah. Scripture therefore set down the law that we are to obey the great court in all they tell us concerning the interpretation of the Torah. For it is in accordance with their understanding, again, it is in accordance with their understanding that he gave them the Torah, even if in your eyes their ruling seems to exchange right for left. So here, then, we have clearly expressed Justice Jackson's view referred to earlier. Namely, the great court is not final because it is infallible, but it is infallible because it is final. And finality, a grant of finality given to it by God. Nachmanides, in this explanation, in essence the same one he offers in his commentary on Maimonides' Sefer HaMitzvot, Book of Commandments, is making 2 points, maybe in tension with one another. First, the divine lawgiver has determined that the sage's interpretation of the law becomes the law. Second, the reason for this determination is to ensure the uniformity of halakhic practice. There is, however, a certain ambiguity in Nachmanides' statement regarding the question of error, and his explanation, as both Professor Moshe Halbertal and I have independently noted, lends itself to both a weak and a strong reading. The weak reading asserts that Nachmanides grants the possibility of the sage's erring, but he deems it to be practically irrelevant. Thus, Professor Avi Sagi maintains that for Nachmanides, there can be a conflict between the divine truth and the human truth of the sages. This is also the view of the Ran, Professor Harvey discussed this earlier. But God revealed his will that in such cases the human truth should prevail. The strong reading asserts that the overall thrust of Nachmanides' statements makes the very issues of truth and falsehood, error and infallibility inapplicable, inasmuch as the meaning of the scriptural text is indeterminate, and it achieves determinate meaning only via the interpretation of the sages. Thus, Professor Aaron Kirschenbaum, contra Professor Sagi, argues, quote, that according to Nachmanides, there is no objective right. The right is what the sages declare to be right. In any event, whatever reading we adopt, we should note that Nachmanides, in his Sefer HaMitzvot, presents only this first explanation, namely, the court is infallible because it is final, together with an interesting and important qualification into which we can't enter here, and not his second explanation. It seems to me that as this first explanation is not a second, so beloved by the Charedim, which must be considered his authoritative view. One thing is clear. As stated earlier, all the classic authorities limit this grant of authority contained in Lo Tasur to matters of halacha, of law, while the ideology of Das Torah extends this grant to matters of hashkafa and public policy. One might say, then, that the function of the other 3 sources I cited, and I'll elaborate upon in a minute, is to bridge this gap between halacha, law, on the one hand, and hashkafa and public policy on the other. So very briefly, then, here the Haredi argument. Demonstrating emunat chachamim, faith in the sages is understood as implying, to cite Rabbi Weinberger, quote, that even knowledgeable rabbis who differ with Gedolim on a particular issue must submit to their superior wisdom. The Cholava, that all is contained in the Torah, Avot 5:19, is understood to mean, to cite an oral tradition attributed to the Chafetz Chaim, that, quote, the person whose view, da'ato, is the view of Torah, das Torah, can solve all worldly problems. However, the das Torah must be pure. If there is a person who possesses das Torah, but is intermingled even slightly with other views from the marketplace or from newspapers, then this das Torah is turbid. Finally, and most recently, it has been argued that kingship serves as a foundation for rabbinic das Torah. Thus, Rabbi David Cohn, a contemporary, well-known Haredi rabbinic scholar, has maintained that the rabbinate, as we know it nowadays, combines Torah authority with kingly authority. These sources, in my view, cannot bear the weight that the exponents of das Torah place on them. Regarding emunat chachamim, faith in the sages, its original meaning and import are obscure, and a wide range of interpretations have been suggested for it. The Haredi understanding of the phrase cited above seems to be a late 19th century development imported from the Hasidic concept of the Rebbe. As for the Cholava, that all is contained in the Torah, it was traditionally used not in a political and communal sense, but simply understood to mean that inasmuch as the Torah is a template of all reality, one who studies Torah gains thereby great insight into human nature, historical and social existence, and indeed a more mystical note into the very secrets of the cosmos itself. The Haredi politicized understanding of the phrase, as represented by the statement cited above, appears to be sort of mid-1930s innovation of well-known Haredi leader, extremist leader, Rabbi Yochanan Wasserman. Finally, with regard to kingship, many medieval authorities, most notably the Rashba, maintain, ironically enough, that if anything, it is the kahal, the community and its lay leadership, and not the rabbinate, that at least in certain respects are the inheritors of the powers of the king. While in the modern era, Rav Kook famously argues that the inheritor of the powers of the king is the Jewish state. The ideology of das Torah, then, at least in my view, does not appear to be firmly grounded in classical sources. Rather, its exponents at best extend those sources in an extreme direction, or at worst, as opposed to drawing the ideology from those sources, project it onto them. The emergence and formation of the ideology of das Torah are then modern developments. The first hints of this ideology may be found in the pronouncements of the Hungarian Orthodox rabbinate in the 1860s and 70s in its nationwide struggle for Orthodox organizational independence. Primarily, however, das Torah as an articulate, self-conscious ideology crystallizes and blossoms in the first half of the 20th century, attaining full-blown expression after the Second World War, and the context in which this process takes place is the rise of Agudath Yisrael as a political party devoted to defending and espousing the interests of Orthodox Jewry in the challenging and often hostile modern environment in which traditional Jewry found itself. While this is not the place to trace this history, key figures whose pronouncements formed the building blocks of the das Torah ideology are, as already mentioned, Rav Elchanan Wasserman, Rav Elio Destler, the Chazon Ish and his disciples, and surprisingly, my teacher, Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, in the period in the late 30s and early 40s when he still aligned himself with the Aguda. So it is against this background that we can understand the multiple functions served by the ideology of das Torah. I listed them here. One major fact in its rise has been, ironically, the manifold modern challenges to the authority of the rabbinic tradition. For these challenges have led many of that tradition's rabbinic exponents to make far-reaching claims on its behalf of the tradition, and even more important, on their own behalf as its authorized interpreters. Here, the analogy with the background on of the rise of the dogma of papal infallibility suggests itself. Also, the breakdown of traditional Jewish communal structures and the concomitant weakening of the power of communal rabbis and lay leaders, a process that accelerated after World War II, the period during which is noted above Das Torah attained full-blown expression, have resulted in the emergence of the Russia Yeshiva, the heads of advanced Talmudic academies with their Torah scholarship and personal charisma to center stage. The concept of Das Torah serves as well as a weapon in the hands of the anti-modern Haredim to delegitimate modern orthodoxy. The Haredim thus argue that the Gedolim who possess Das Torah are precisely the anti-modernist Torah scholars whose views are pure Das Torah, uncorrupted by the modern world. In this connection, you can see the oral tradition attributed to the Chafetz Chaim. Above all, the ideology of Das Torah, with its extreme reading of Emunat Chachamim, faith in the sages, is perhaps the central element in the ethic of submission that characterizes the anti-modern Haredi worldview. From this perspective, a primary practical function of Das Torah today, and to come back to the beginning, why it's in the news today, proves to be the suppression of what appears to be the rising tide of dissent, accompanied by moves toward modernization within the Haredi community. This use of Das Torah to suppress dissent and enforce uniformity within the Haredi community came to the fore not so long ago in the Slifkin affair. In 2004, several works dealing with the issues of Torah and science by Rabbi Natan Slifkin, a moderate Haredi scholar, works which had received approbations from well-known moderate Haredi rabbinic figures, were banned by major extreme Haredi rabbinic authorities for supposedly containing heretical statements regarding the age of the earth and evolution and the scientific accuracy of various Talmudic statements. I cannot enter into details here, but my reading of the event suggests that the more extreme wing of the Haredi community used Das Torah here as a way to suppress, quote, enlightened views that had penetrated into the more moderate Haredi circles. Most revealing, while many rabbinic figures from these more moderate circles, particularly in North America, were to begin with very troubled by the ban, since, in their view, it made Haredim look like Neanderthals. Not that one is allowed to believe in the existence of Neanderthals, but once the ban became a matter of Das Torah, these more moderate figures, with few exceptions, either fell into line or fell silent. It is against this background as well, to return to my lecture's beginning, that we may understand Rabbi Shimshon Scherer's speech at the recent Aguda convention with its call for total subservience to Das Torah. A reading of that speech indicates that Rabbi Scherer, who on that and other occasions appears to have assumed the role of the Aguda's ideological enforcer, invoked Das Torah both in response to growing internal criticisms in the ever-expanding blog world of Haredi policies, institutions, and personalities, and as well in response to timid but still unmistakable moves to greater openness evident in various new popular Haredi magazines. Rabbi Scherer's speech is available on YouTube, and listeners can determine for themselves whether his fiery rhetoric reflects a sense of confidence or insecurity. In my original paper on Das Torah and other essays of mine as well, I contrasted Das Torah with the process of reason psak halacha, halachic legal decision-making, juridical decision-making, which allows for criticism and debate within a revealed framework. In that connection, I cited the distinguished rabbinic scholar, Professor Ephraim Urbach, who noted, as far as I know, recourse to Das Torah has never been made in halachic debate. The issue of the Chazon Ish might change that, but for the purpose of time, I'll leave that to the side. Let me come to the title of the session, Agents of the Divine. Of course, in traditional Jewish thought, judges have indeed been seen as such divine agents. The verse which was quoted earlier today, Elohim nitzad ba'adat el b'kerev Elohim yishpot, is generally translated nowadays as God stands in the divine assembly. Among the gods, the heavenly beings does he judge. The traditional view, however, is that the verse is referring not to the heavenly, but to the earthly court. Accordingly, the second part of the verse should be translated as, among the judges does he judge. This idea of the judge as an agent of the divine, to give one example, is expressed in a comment of the Maharal of Prague on the commandment of imitatio Dei. V'halachta b'drachav, walking in God's ways. The Maharal notes that this commandment refers only to imitating God's attributes of mercy, not his attributes of judgment. As he is merciful, so you too shall be merciful. As he is gracious, so you too be gracious. Asks the Maharal, why is this so? His answer, as developed by the noted 20th century rabbinic theologian Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner, is that loving kindness is a human trait. So a person, by performing human acts of loving kindness, imitates the divine activity of loving kindness. However, a person has no right to judge another, for the judgment belongs to God, Deuteronomy 1:17. A person can sit in judgment over another only in his capacity as an agent of God, authorized to act on his behalf. So when a person judges another, he is not performing a human act of judgment that imitates the divine activity of judgment. Rather, he is carrying out the divine activity of judgment, precisely in his capacity of an agent of God. However, and here I conclude, it seems to me that this idea of the judge as an agent of the divine holds true, specifically with regard to sitting in and executing judgment. But with regard to seeking to determine the law, the subject of my lecture this evening, it seems to me, even taking into account Nachmanides, but that the general thrust of rabbinic Judaism is that the rabbis, even if authorized by God to so determine the law, can only do so by relying on their best but always fallible human judgment. The greatest danger posed by the concept of Das Torah lies in its clothing that fallible human judgment in a garment of quasi-infallibility, and consequently in its giving rise to a culture of submission and uniformity, silence and acquiescence. As I stated earlier, the culture of halakha, of rabbinic Judaism, has always been one of criticism and debate within a revealed framework. I, for one, hope that it will always remain so.
Thank you. That was marvelous. I'd like now to welcome Professor Bo Burt from Yale Law School, who will talk about the divine constitution and judicial infallibility.
In some ways, more than other conferences like this that I've participated in, the three lectures, the two you have heard and mine, I think put a considerable burden on you as listeners, because we wrote these papers, as it were, in isolation from one another. As I think about Professor Kaplan's paper, Professor Parker's paper, I see some really quite intriguing parallels that can be drawn with secular authority and what I have to say about judicial infallibility under our Constitution. But I only lightly sketch them in my lecture, so there's a burden on you, it seems to me, but it's a good burden to kind of draw our three presentations together. And I hope we have enough time, well, we'll have some time in any event, for you to do that in concert with us. So I want to begin with Justice Jackson, who has been invoked several times already. But I want to do so to kind of both contextualize his statement about why the United States Supreme Court is final, and it's not because they're infallible, contextualize it and begin to draw out a theme that's the basic theme of my paper. And that is, on the one hand, the claims for judicial infallibility are a historic phenomenon. They didn't start at the beginning. They grew as the institution emerged, just as you have heard about the rabbinic claims that kind of blossomed at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, at the same time that the papal claims did. So it's a historic phenomenon. It's not a necessary phenomenon. On the other hand, the idea evolved in this way. But the theme that I want to pursue is to watch with a kind of careful attention to some specific decisions of the United States Supreme Court, watch the way that the claims for infallibility, the more emphatic they became, the more they undermined themselves by close attention. And it seems to me that with that theme, perhaps we can then return to the comparative dimension. So Justice Jackson said, we are not final because we're infallible because we are final. The context of the opinion in which he rendered this, that was actually a recurring opinion on his part, was a kind of stinging criticism of judicial authority. He was not saying it to kind of trumpet infallibility, quite the contrary. And in the course of this, the actual focus of the opinion, or of the case, was the question of the Supreme Court's authority over state criminal prosecutions under habeas corpus. And the majority basically said in this case that there are no limits to the Supreme Court's authority over the state constitution. And Jackson, in his sharp, joking, half-joking way, said, this is overreaching on your part. So I want to first identify some of the reasoning that Jackson put forward about why infallibility was not a convincing kind of a claim, and then to contextualize what he was saying historically. Jackson said, after he kind of enunciated his famous aphorism, the basic problem, he said, is that the generalizations of the 14th Amendment, the supposed source of authority, one might say of divine authority for the court, the generalizations of the 14th Amendment are so indeterminate that this court has found it a ready instrument to magnify its own authority. Of course, considerable uncertainty is inherent in decisional law, which in changing times purport to interpret implications of constitutional provisions so cryptic and vague. It is prudent to assume that the scope and reach of the 14th Amendment will continue to be unknown and unknowable, and that its interpretation will be more or less swayed by contemporary intellectual fashions and political currents. So he's acknowledging that, at least from his perspective, the guidance from the divine instrument is cryptic, vague, unknowable, and unknown, and yet we're in the business of interpreting. How do we understand this? Well, one way to understand what Jackson was struggling with is to recognize that he published this opinion at a discrete moment in history, specifically February 9th, 1953. In the history of the U.S. Supreme Court, this is a very important date. February 9th, 1953, fell during the interval between the first Supreme Court argument in Brown v. Board of Education, which took place in December 1952, and the re-argument, which took place in December 1953. Now, when the court first heard argument in the Brown case, the enormity of what they were being asked to do and what they were working their way to doing was so overwhelming, and the court was itself so divided that all they could do was agree to have it set down for re-argument later. And it was in this interval that Jackson was obviously thinking about the limits of the guidance that the document gave to him. And so when he publicly mocked claims to judicial infallibility, he and his brethren were struggling their way toward what was and remains the most ambitious and even extravagant deployment of judicial power in the court's entire jurisprudence. That is to take on the racial segregation regime in the Deep South and kind of reshape the entire social organization. Now, Brown and its immediate sequelae will be the centerpiece today for my exploration of the ways in which the justices are secular priests and rabbis for American society, both explicitly claim to be infallible and at the same time undermine this claim to infallibility. The court's opinion in the first Brown decision on May 17, 1954, was disarmingly honest in acknowledging that their authority for proclaiming the end of racially segregated public schools did not emanate from any explicit constitutional command. The court, in an opinion by Chief Justice Earl Warren, openly admitted that the historical research that had been offered to it by attorneys on both sides, and he said the justice's own investigation about the intention of the framers of the 14th Amendment regarding racial segregation in public schools, cast some light, he said, but not enough to resolve the problem with which we are faced. At best, the court said, through Warren, the historical materials are inconclusive. Thus, the Brown court explicitly turned away from reliance on the text of the Constitution, or on, one might say, a divine directive. In approaching this problem, the court said, we cannot turn the clock back to 1868 when the amendment was adopted, or even to 1896 when Plessy v. Ferguson was written, the famous Supreme Court opinion upholding racial segregation under the 14th Amendment. Thus, rather than relying on the explicit text of the Constitution, the court derived its authority in Brown v. Board of Education from what? Their own infallibility? But this reliance cannot be, as Jackson acidly observed, because he and his brethren in their essential nature were infallible, but only because there was no super Supreme Court standing above them. Now, latter-day apostles of originalism, that is to say, justices, scholars of Justice Scalia's persuasion, who insist that one can go back to the text and get definitive direction from the text itself. These originalist apostles are stuck with the problem of justifying Brown v. Board of Education. If you read the opinion in Brown, the opinion says there is no original understanding that guides us in this matter. Instead, we are consulting something else. So Scalia and his group, it seems to me, are kind of in a bind. They can repudiate Brown, except repudiating Brown now seems to be impossible. Both politically, morally, Brown is universally regarded, and rightly so, as one of the high points of the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court in our social life. The fact stubbornly remains that the court that decided Brown searched for, but honestly admitted it could not find explicit guidance to lead them to their opinion. So if originalism doesn't work for justifying Brown v. Board of Education, if the constitutional document doesn't dictate this result, then we're faced with the problem, how did the court that decided Brown see itself? How should we see the justices in retrospect? As the mere agents of a constitution? Or were the justices simply claiming to be divine in their own right, kind of bootstrapping in the way that I would read the rabbis and the Pope in Professor Kaplan, Professor Parker's reviews? Now, Brown was vast in its ambition, but it was not the last word or the most explicit word for the court's claim of infallible authority. That apotheosis came 4 years later in 1958, when the court decided a case called Cooper v. Aaron. In that case, the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, declared that he was not bound by decision to the Supreme Court and deployed state National Guard troops to bar the entry of any black students to the all-white high school in Little Rock. This was a huge challenge, obviously, to the court's authority. I'm not sure it was, well, actually, it strikes me as similar to Garibaldi and the Pope. That is, say, Garibaldi's troops surrounding the Vatican and making Pius IX a prisoner in his own house, which is so it was virtually the same. Now, Faubus didn't send the troops to Washington to imprison the justices, but he said, you're not the law in Arkansas. The court rebuffed the claim, and in doing so, it issued a demand for unquestioning obedience, the most explicit demand ever inscribed in its jurisprudence. But beneath the surface of the opinion in the Little Rock case, if we carefully observe it, we can see doubts about the court's claim for infallibility, some doubts that the justices themselves seemed aware of while trying to suppress public acknowledgement of them, and other doubts that the justices may not have seen, but that are visible to us nonetheless. So I want to spend some time now digging into this aspect of the court's decision in Cooper v. Aaron. We should turn first to the surface of the opinion. On its surface, the court could not be more adamant in its demand for unconditional obedience. In a lengthy passage midway through its opinion, the court proclaimed that, quote, the interpretation of the 14th Amendment enunciated by this court in the Brown case is the supreme law of the land, and that denial of this proposition by any state legislator or executive or judicial officer is war against the Constitution. To establish their claim, the court cited a series of unanimous Supreme Court decisions with opinions written by Chief Justice Marshall in 1803 and 1809, by Chief Justice Rogers Tawney in 1859, and by Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes in 1932. This parade of historic authority conveyed an underlying message. The Constitution, as it has been understood virtually from the beginning, the court claimed, demands deference to judicial interpretation of it, regardless of the moral persuasiveness of those interpretations. Thus, in the court's treatment, the binding character of Chief Justice Marshall's opinions are no different from the binding character of Chief Justice Tawney's opinions, notwithstanding his use of judicial authority in the notorious Dred Scott case to protect the institution of slavery, and no different from Chief Justice Hughes' opinions, notwithstanding his use of judicial authority to obstruct the New Deal economic recovery measures. The lesson drawn by Cooper v. Aaron from this equal estimation of John Marshall, Roger B. Tawney, and Charles Evans Hughes is that the Supreme Court can do no wrong. Anyone who ever challenges the court is ipso facto in the wrong. In this claim, the Supreme Court, to my mind, resembles God as he appears from the whirlwind in the book of Job and in the mind of Job's friends who condemn Job for criticizing God as unjust. This is, of course, an extravagant claim for the court, but the justices themselves knew that they were engaging in extravagance. This is evident from a difference between an early draft of the court's opinion in Cooper v. Aaron and the final published version. In an early draft, Justice William Brennan cited Marbury v. Madison in 1803 for the court's foundational claim to supremacy. But he added the observation that Marshall's opinion, quote, was not without its critics then and even now, but it has never been deviated in this court. Justice Hugo Black objected to this observation and urged Brennan to inject, quote, more punch and vigor in his claim for judicial supremacy, and even more revealingly, Justice Tom Clark asked Brennan to add more hoopla. In its final version, the court's opinion omitted any reference to the critics of judicial supremacy and instead proclaimed that the principle announced in Marbury has ever since been respected by this court and the country as a permanent and indispensable feature of our constitutional system. The justices clearly saw their opinion as an occasion for self-inflation. If I can draw another analogy, rather like the Wizard of Oz, a small man who concealed himself inside an enormous contraption that projected an image of terrifying majesty. The justices' determination to inflate themselves, to add hoopla to their self-presentation, was evident in the opening gambit of their opinion in Cooper v. Aaron. For the first time in its history, the court's opinion was not identified as written by one of the justices, or as ascribed to all of them as a, quote, per curiam opinion, without specific attribution. Instead, the heading of the opinion in Cooper v. Aaron, without precedent, listed each justice individually by name, as if the court was stretching to indicate that it was not simply unanimous, but very unanimous in rebuffing the challenge from Governor Faubus. But as impressive as this deviation from past practice may have seemed, it seemed to me that this was the first indication of an internal weakness in the court's, a lack of confidence, really, in the court's claim. Because in the end, by my reading, the listing of all of their names individually kind of removed the court from presenting itself as an ethereal, superhuman entity, a truly godlike celestial being. In the end, they were just 9 old men, by name. So in this sense, the effort to project an image of conjoined strength ended up, to my eyes, conveying some self-betraying weakness. The weakness was amplified by another element in the court's opinion, and that is, in its final paragraph, the court ended with a stirring reaffirmation of its ruling 4 years earlier in Brown v. Board of Education. But the very terms of that reaffirmation themselves betrayed weakness. Here is what the court said. The basic decision in Brown was unanimously reached by this court. Since the first Brown opinion, 3 new justices have come to the court. They are at one with the justices still on the court who participated in that basic decision as to its correctness, and that decision is now unanimously reaffirmed. Now, this is very stirring. It's beautiful to read it, kind of thrilling. But there's an oddity here that's unacknowledged. Why was it necessary or even appropriate for the court to announce that the 3 new justices agreed with their predecessors? If the court were truly and infallibly supreme in its interpretation of the Constitution, why wouldn't the supremacy extend to binding everyone, including those who subsequently joined the court? Alternatively, if latter-day justices are free to ignore prior court rulings, as the reaffirmation implies, why shouldn't this freedom extend to the institutional actors who are responsible for choosing new justices? And if the President and Senate are free to appoint justices committed to overturning past judicial rulings, why shouldn't the President and the Senate be equally authorized to contest court rulings in other ways, for example, by refusing to enforce the court's ruling? And here we reach another aspect of Cooper v. Aaron. In Cooper v. Aaron itself, 1 year before the court ruled, President Eisenhower had nationalized the Arkansas State Militia to take them away from Governor Faubus, and he sent other federal troops to Little Rock with instructions to escort black school children into the white schools rather than blocking them as Faubus had ordered. But could the court have compelled the president to take this action? As a practical matter, how would the court enforce its command against a recalcitrant president? But as a principled matter, even more significantly, the Constitution specifically designates the president, not the court, as commander-in-chief of the nation's armed forces. These large questions were provoked by the constitutional crisis that the governor of Arkansas presented to the court. But lurking behind these questions, there are some more pervasive aspects of the court's ordinary practices that quietly, but even more persistently, call into question the court's explicit claims for infallibility and supremacy. By underscoring their unanimity in both the original opinion in Brown and in Cooper v. Aaron, the justices implicitly acknowledged that the routine appearance of dissents in its day-to-day jurisprudence itself calls into question the solidity and weight of its institutional authority. The underlying uneasiness conveyed by the absence of unanimity in the court's decisions is revealed by the historic practice regarding dissents. In the founding era, most notably during the 35-year tenure of Chief Justice Marshall, dissents were rare. Indeed, the overwhelming majority of court rulings during his regime were issued with opinions written by him, as if to say that the court was not a collection of justices, but a single entity embodied in the person of its Chief Justice. Dissenting opinions became more frequent after the Civil War, but even so, the possibility that dissents would call into doubt the monolithic appearance of the court was muted by the common practice among the justices of dissenting only once, that is to say, only in the first instance when a rule was announced that a dissenting justice might have disagreed with, and thereafter the dissenting justice silently acquiesced in subsequent applications of that rule. With this etiquette, the imagery of the court as infallible was honored. That is, the court majority infallibly set the rules, and an initially dissenting justice held back from casting doubt on that infallibility by repeatedly emphasizing his disagreement. Even if the justice remained unconvinced, his silent acquiescence implied that the law had been established by the original majority, infallibly established, one might say. The original practice of rare dissents, or the later practice of less rare but quickly suppressed dissents, has by today, by any reader of the newspaper, vanished from the jurisprudence of the court. Dissent explodes all over the pages of the United States report with, in historic terms, dramatic break with the past. And this original practice has vanished from the jurisprudence. I think this is because the court has become so confident in its own institutional authority that the justices no longer feel much pressure to bolster themselves by presenting a united face. In this sense, the extraordinary affirmation of unanimity by the court in the Little Rock case was a response to the unaccustomed challenge to its authority. Dissents are not, however, the only ordinary practice that undermine the court's self-presentation as infallible. The court's willingness to reverse its previous rulings convey the same undermining implication. In the modern era, reversals have not occurred with the same abandon as the geometric escalation of dissents, but reversals do occur much more frequently today than in earlier times. Even so, when the court does reverse itself, we can see a sense of unease in its presentational rhetoric, a sense that the court is undermining its institutional authority when it admits that a past ruling was incorrect. The linkage between the court's institutional obligation never to change its mind and its claim to authority was revealed with special emphasis in the plurality opinion in an abortion case jointly authored in 1992 by Justices O'Connor, Kennedy, and Souter. The case was Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania against Casey. In that case, 4 justices voted to overrule Roe v. Wade: Chief Justice Rehnquist and Justices White, Scalia, and Thomas. 2 justices wholeheartedly defended Roe, Justices Blackmun and Stevens, and the deciding 3-justice plurality that constituted 5 votes refused to reverse Roe. But as Justice Scalia observed in his dissent, the plurality's joint opinion cannot bring itself to say that Roe was correct as an original matter. The plurality's unwillingness to overturn Roe was based on a different ground. Citing the intense opposition that Roe had engendered in our national political life, the plurality stated to overrule under fire would subvert the court's legitimacy beyond any serious question. If it is true that the court's authority and its legitimacy would be undermined by admitting that its past decision in Roe is erroneous and should be overruled, then the court's stature hung by a thin strand of precisely 1 vote in 1992, when 4 justices voted for the reversal of Roe, and its status remains in the same peril today with 4 justices, Chief Justice Roberts, Justices Scalia, Thomas, and Alito, themselves committed to overturn Roe. So, depending on the results of the presidential election, if a Republican wins, given the age of the liberal supporters of the court now of Roe, Roe is doomed, it seems to me. And so if infallibility is the key to their authority, the very fact that Roe survives only so narrowly and perilously at this moment must be publicly seen as a virtual repudiation of institutional infallibility. There is thus a considerable paradox in the Supreme Court's approach to fallibility. On one side, the court regularly proclaims that one way or another it is infallible and must receive unquestioning obedience to its rulings, and yet on the other side, the court's routine practices regarding the permissibility of dissent and the possibility of reversing prior decisions are inconsistent with any claim to infallibility. And this self-contradiction points to a different truth, and this is the theme I want to end on, a more disturbing truth about the judicial authority. If the court's assigned constitutional role is to protect liberty and equality, can it accomplish this goal wholly on its own, or does the protection of liberty and equality require voluntary acquiescence, voluntary self-restraint on the part of those who would curtail liberty? When the courts speak to those who oppose liberty, those who command the forces of government, whether it be elected officials or the majority of voters who choose those officials, the court at its core is doing nothing more but nothing less than appealing to the conscience of the governors. The court ultimately has no practical power, no command of the sword or the purse, as Alexander Hamilton put it in the Federalist Papers, to enforce its will. But even deeper than this instrumental consideration about the court's practical enforcement, there is an important way, and a way that is not as fully understood, I think, as it should be, that the core constitutional ideals, in particular the ideal of equality, depends for its coherence, not just its practical effectiveness, on the voluntary acceptance of the losing party on the court's docket. To return to Cooper v. Aaron. Cooper v. Aaron and the effort to enforce Brown generally makes this proposition quite clear. At the end of their unanimous opinion in Cooper v. Aaron, as I've said, the court stirringly proclaimed that the obedience of the states to the court's command is indispensable for the protection of the freedoms guaranteed by our fundamental charter. Our constitutional ideal of equal justice under law is thus made a living truth. But stop for just a minute. What is the content of this ideal? Can this ideal of equal justice under law be made a living truth if the only way that black school children can find admission to previously all-white schools is when accompanied by armed guards? Recall that in the Brown opinion, the first Brown opinion, the court's indictment of segregated public schools rested on its conclusion that separating black school children, and now I quote, from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. If black school children can gain access to classrooms with whites only when escorted by children, only by forced entry, how can this generate a feeling of equal status in their common community? How can this not affect their hearts and minds in a way likely ever to be undone? I do not mean to say that there is no proper role for enforced integration to countermand the enforced segregation that had been imposed on black students. But to vindicate the ideal of equality, this application of force can be nothing more than a way station to voluntary acceptance of a new reparative regime in the relations between blacks and whites. Neither forced association nor even grudging truce lines in a relationship of continued hostility can make a living truth of our constitutional ideal. Mutual respect, voluntarily offered on both sides, is the core characteristic of a social relationship among equals. The court has the capacity and the obligation to identify when the equality ideal is violated on one side or another of a social relation. But the court cannot remedy inequality through force imposed on one side or another. In its very nature, equality rests on freely offered consent, and that is not within the capacity of the court to consent to itself. So at its core, the court cannot be infallible. The court must appeal for voluntary allegiance and submission. One might say, using the language of religion, for voluntary love. And here I would draw an analogy which we could perhaps play with. It seems to me, as I understand the biblical tradition, both in Judaism and in Christianity, the basic request, one might say, or command, depending on where you read it, that God issues is you must love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul. But at its core, though the biblical text obscures this in a lot of different ways, forced love, in my view, is not what the God of the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Bible is asking for. It's voluntarily offered love. That is the core. And if your centerpiece is a claim to infallibility, the core command, if you will, that you want to enforce is beyond your capacity to enforce. And that, it seems to me, is a deep similarity between the role of the Supreme Court and its periodic assertions of infallibility and you must obey, and yet its dependence, not just in practical terms, but in principle, to say that forced obedience is worth nothing It's voluntarily offered compliance that is worth everything. And here is the court's, if you will, weakness, or if it can bring itself to acknowledge this fully, I would say its moral strength. And I would extend that as well to biblical authority, both the Hebrew and Christian Bible. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Professor Burt. I found the presentation extremely thoughtful and challenging, and I'd like to continue the very gracious dialogue that Professor Burt has started already, and invite our three panelists to have at it. Who would like to?
Professor Kaplan, you want to start?
All right. Let me switch. Originally, Professor Burt was going to go first, and it was switched, I understand, because Professor Park was speaking about Catholicism, and I was speaking about rabbinic views, sort of religious, and then Professor Burt was more secular. So in a certain sense, I guess he was the odd man out. I think from his presentation, it's quite clear that he's not the odd man out at all. And I'm wondering to what extent Professor Parker might is sort of representing a Catholic view, and I'm representing a Jewish view, and perhaps Professor Burt in some ways representing a more radical Protestant view with the emphasis on what? One might say that. Okay, with the emphasis on love and voluntarily offered. I seem to remember, actually, I meant to check it. I meant to Google it. Like nowadays, you can find everything. There's a statement by by Judge Learned Hand about something similar to what you argued, that if somehow the Constitution's not in the hearts of people, you somehow can't really enforce it. And on the other hand, if it is, it doesn't really need enforcement. Something to that effect. I had meant to check it. I don't. And so it seems to me, and I understand the point about sort of force and coercion, but most people it's not that way. You're somewhere in between. I mean, there's a certain type of commitment, perhaps to certain basic norms and rules of law and Constitution, but maybe not a complete type of commitment. And in that sense, maybe you say it's a way station, but I would place more emphasis in a sense of law in terms of actually creating a climate of respect and law, which might begin with enforcement, but once the enforcement has somehow become routinized and changed patterns, actually changed patterns leads to changed attitudes as well. So I would, in a sense, give more weight to the idea of command and coercion, although obviously it can't carry everything by itself. So just one more point. It occurs to me in some ways that I'm the odd, well, we're all men here, so I can say I'm the odd man out here. Because in terms of Catholicism, you do have a final authority, whether it's the Pope or the Pope together with the Council. In America, you have a final authority, there's the Supreme Court, and then the question is, what is the extent of that? To what extent is connected with infallibility? In Judaism, maybe if I had been given a purely scholarly paper, I would have. In Judaism, there was a final authority at one point, at least in theory. At least in theory, there was the Great Court, and I touched upon that. Nowadays, and I think this is the point, we don't have this type of final authority. We have individual rabbis who, on the basis of their own rabbinic learning, powers of persuasion, certain type of stature, there perhaps more are given a certain authority, almost a type of stateless law. Professor Robert Cover has spoken. about that. So had this been a purely scholarly paper, I might have just spoken about the issue of the authority of the Great Court and debate. Nachmanides gone into more detail. What Maimonides says, speak about the Yerushalmi and the Sifrei at greater length, but I wanted, in a certain sense, because of the public nature of the panel, to be relevant. So there's really no more final authority. So in a certain sense, what you have is once you have individual rabbinic authorities, if you want to give them some type of final authority, some ultimate authority, nowadays it can't be institutional, but it's almost you have to say it's a type of charisma, it's a type of inspiration. It's because they're infallible, because they have no institutional grants. So a certain type of irony, as I say, the deinstitutionalization of rabbinic authority leads to, if one wants to push the notion of authority for whatever reason, almost I would say inevitably leads to a type of aura of at least a type of quasi-infallibility. So maybe I'll stop here.
One of the things that I'm really struck by is how what seems to be a common thread is the crisis in modernity in the latter half of the 19th century into the 20th century, the crisis of authority and certainty. The concern, especially in religious communities, but I think in society as well. You have this struggle, where does authority lie? Where does certainty lie? And one response to that, at least among Roman Catholics, was to not only re-emphasize, but to radically advance the understanding of the authority of the papacy in the life of the church. And but it's the issue of coercion that you've raised, Professor Bird, intrigues me, because really, in many ways, that level of authoritarianism in the life of the Roman Catholic Church in the first half of the 20th century led directly to the events of the Second Vatican Council, the rejection of a kind of iron hand controlling almost every aspect of the life of the church.
Would you say it was a conclusive rejection or just a rejection for the moment?
It was a rejection that we're still struggling to come to terms with, because the Second Vatican Council represented an effort by safe men. I mean, all the bishops theoretically were supposed to be safe, on board with the established ultramontane order, and they resoundingly rejected it. But the decisions that were made by the council and the documents that were produced created their own kind of nervousness, because what was let loose was a kind of freedom that Roman Catholics had not really experienced really in anyone's living memory. And so the first test case of that was Humanae Vitae. John the 23rd set up a commission. Paul VI advanced that. During the council, they reserved the issue of contraception to themselves, and by 1966, just after the council, the commission was made up of 71 people. The vast majority of them were lay people. For the first time, there were married people consulted on this matter, and the majority on that commission recommended a relaxation of the church's teaching on artificial contraception, and made an argument that it was part of what they asserted was a development of doctrine. There was a small minority of clerical moral theologians, 5, who wrote a dissenting opinion. And what intrigued me was that they made almost exactly the same argument that the Supreme Court justices made in 1992. They argued that if the teaching on contraception was reversed and Catholics were allowed to use contraception, that it would subvert the moral authority of papal authority and of church teaching. And so they had to maintain the ban on contraception in order for the authority of the church to be secure. Now, the irony is that there was a period of about 5 years of limbo during this commission, and during that period of time, most, at least North Atlantic Roman Catholics, had made their decision. And it was well known, after 2 years of prevarication on the part of Paul VI, he received the commission's report in 1966, sat on it for 2 years. And when he did come out, everyone was shocked. And there was this widespread reaction that said, enough. By that time, about 80% plus of Roman Catholics were using contraception. Now it's probably 98 to 99%. It's a very tiny minority that don't use contraception. But that teaching has not only been maintained by Paul VI's successors, but it's been reaffirmed and in many ways seen. I mean, I heard secondhand in the 80s when I was a student at Fribourg of a conversation that happened in the Vatican with John Paul II and then Cardinal Ratzinger. And the observation was made at the lunch table that the reaction to Humanae Vitae was the beginning of the lay rebellion, and that if the laity was to be brought back into submission, it had to be brought back into submission on that issue, or all was lost. It's an intriguing situation, but you know it illustrates your point about the precariousness of authority.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Well, no. I just have one footnote: the precarious of authority, which gives the people in the robes,
right,
an option of either pretending it's not precarious at all,
right,
or alternatively soliciting consent, attentiveness to other views,
and that's
and this is a live option. You know, regardless of how you think of yourself. So long as you understand, you're obliged to understand yourself one way or another, as either having a big stick and you keep beating it on the ground,
right,
or keeping the big stick that tradition gives you, kind of in reserve and speaking around that. So your voice is heard with the stick, but then you speak softly.
But and that's what John Paul II did very effectively for his very long pontificate. He was a very charismatic figure, and in many ways people honored him and paid public respect to him while they disobeyed his teaching.
Yeah. Well, just again, the situation is different in terms of Jewish law nowadays because there's no central authority. But I mean, obviously we have rabbinic decisions. But it's rather interesting. The leading scholar at Israel at a certain point was Rabbi Abram Isaiah Karlitz, a Chazon Ish, whom one could say a lot about. And someone asked the question of Rabbi Moses Feinstein, who was the leading decider in North America, that he lived in Bnei Brak with a Chazon Ish, a certain rabbinic figure. Was he allowed to disagree on matters of law with the Chazon Ish? Because shouldn't he be the ultimate authority? Rabbi Moses Feinstein said, as long as you're a competent rabbinic scholar and you have made a strong case based on the texts, then you are permitted to disagree. Obviously, people will give it, what were, but the idea is that you. And I think this is a more traditional thing in terms of rabbinic decision making. I just want to make one point about this idea of reversal. Actually, it's rather striking that getting back to the Great Court on matters of law and judgment, Maimonides says that a lesser court can actually overrule a previous court, even if it's greater, because it's a matter of judgment. So matters of judgment, whatever seems to you to be in accordance with the law. In terms of actually decrees, which are and ordinances, are a matter of more strict authority, there you actually, the later a later court actually has to be greater in authority. I just want to make one more point in terms of whether overruling earlier decisions will undermine respect. And actually, in your original paper, Professor Burt, you quoted something which you didn't mention here, about James Madison, that the Constitution should be very difficult to amend because every popular enacted amendment would carry an implication of some defect in the government, and that would deprive the government of that veneration which is necessary for requisite stability. When I read that, I was reminded of what Maimonides says, actually a very striking statement in the Guide 341. Maimonides says as follows, very striking. Since God knew that the commandments of the Torah, at least some of them, would have to be changed because of changes in time and circumstances, therefore he forbid them to change it. Because change, so the other, it's very strange. Because changing would then undermine the authority of the law. But, then he says, he gave the court a way of modifying it. So somehow you can't have too much change, you can't have direct change, you can't just simply say the law is off the books, but there are ways of somehow limited type and modifying it. So you see here Maimonides' very interesting statement is concerned about the need for change, for amendment. On the other hand, the danger, at least that he felt, that too much and too direct change would undermine the authority of the entire system. Now, maybe this is because this is a divine system. So, I think the point is following. People would think, let's say, that a divine system should be able to anticipate everything. So why should there be a change, right? The system is really perfect. Maimonides understood that no legal system, even if it comes from God, even divinely inspired, really can anticipate everything. So there's a need for change. But most people don't understand that. So there's too much change. I think, well, by definition, it's not divine. But so he sort of goes back and forth between that.
In the specific context of Jewish law,
right?
The ideal is to have man be partners with God in the ongoing creation of the universe, and that couldn't happen if there was a perfect preordained set of rules.
Right. Well, again, that comes back to the issue of Nachmanides, where when Nachmanides says that law by definition is somewhat, the laws in written form is somewhat ambiguous, and therefore you have to give the rabbis the authority to interpret it. Actually, I think the 16th century rabbinic scholar Solomon Lurie has said, even if God gave 10,000 pages, right, of laws, like
Code of Divine Regulations,
like an entire code to cover it never could cover every possibility, because there always are new possibilities. So in some sense, you have to give, as it were, certain basic rules, certain basic interpretations, and then leave it for the rabbis of each generation somehow to read and interpret.
Perhaps we could open up to discussion.
Yeah.
No, for
Go ahead.
folks out there.
Sir.
Seeing these three different entities, as it were, Catholicism and Judaism and Supreme Court, or secular judicial system, it seems pretty clear what you said is that competition with modernity, exactly when it occurs, it seems to really heat up in the 19th century, and certainly in terms of Judaism, 19th century, but then a great deal in the 20th century. So that's clear a conflict with modernity. But historically, what kind of conflict is the American judicial system going through? Does it have anything to do with modernity? Why do you see them asserting it so strongly at that particular moment in time?
There are some quite direct parallels. The standard view, but it's a bleached out and inaccurate view, is that 1803, Chief Justice Marbury v. Madison established the supremacy of the Supreme Court of the Constitution. I begin my first year constitutional law class when I teach it. We spend the first 3 weeks unraveling that. That was not his claim. It was on the face of it, he was aggrandizing his own institutional authority. The presidency didn't buy that, the Congress didn't buy that, the states didn't buy that. In fact, without going into great detail, Madison and Jefferson both in 1800 drafted for state legislatures, Madison for Virginia, Jefferson for Kentucky, resolutions by the legislatures overturning Supreme Court rulings. And the issue of the authority of the Supreme Court was actually unsettled until Dred Scott. Dred Scott was the crisis of modernity in this country. We were about to explode in civil war, and the Supreme Court stepped in and really that opinion in 1858 was the first clear claim by the Supreme Court for supremacy of interpretation over all the other branches. And they did it explicitly. In fact, there's a concurring opinion by Justice Wayne in that case, saying the country's about to erupt into violence. And so we alone stand between violence and the rule of law. And so it must come to us. And my view is that the experience of the Civil War lives on in the jurisprudence of the court, and it's fascinatingly, it's mid-19th century. This origins are forgotten, and the court parades itself. But one other word about the court's experience in Brown v. Board of Education. They clearly came up against their incapacity to enforce their will. It was very clear to the members of the court that had the Congress not adopted the Civil Rights Act of '64 and '65, that Brown would be a dead letter. They couldn't enforce it. So they touched a moral thread, but they got a response. It was like responsive reading, I say, in a book that I published a number of years ago. The court posed the question to the whole society, do you want to continue this institution? But it's up to you if you do. We can't stop you. And the Congress overwhelmingly answered. I mean, they broke the first breaking of the filibuster on civil rights matters. So the justices of that time implicitly realized that their authority was limited and in a way should be limited. And then they promptly forgot the lesson, in my view, in the way that they handled a number of very difficult issues that came to them in the 1970s, preeminently Roe v. Wade. I think, and this is a long conversation, there was a different way for the courts to have approached the issue of freedom and privacy and abortion than simply overturning all existing statutes and writing their own version of it. And then they had to protect their authority, which they have done, and our politics have been roiled by it, our society has been roiled by it. Now, I'm not saying that they should have left the abortion statutes untouched. There's a lawyer's way of dealing with this, and the court had an option. They could have said all existing statutes are too vague to be effective criminal law statutes, turning the issue back to the legislatures to try and come up with something that wasn't vague, which they never could do. But starting a back and forth, instead of saying, we've spoken, it's the last word, we don't want to hear from anybody. I mean, the church in particular, well, I could go on, but it's fascinating to me that the Catholic Church, in response to Roe v. Wade, which was such a frontal assault on the beliefs of the Catholic Church, threw away their concern about not getting involved in politics, and said, no, we must, it's a moral necessity for us to do this. Before that, they were very cautious. I mean, we'd only had our first Catholic president a decade earlier. So the Catholic Church was very careful to respect this boundary between politics and religion. And the moral pressure that was put on them, led them to throw it away. Understandably from their perspective, very understandably. And the court could have dealt with this in a very different way and still have helped to bring us to where we are now, which is abortion is not actually freely available in practice in many places in the country, but the principle has been established. In fact, I think we'd be better off. You get me started on this.
We have time for, yes.
The motivation behind this question is, I think, continuing in the same vein, but it's to suggest that maybe we're all being a little bit too hard on all these folks who are desperately claiming infallibility. certainly see this with Garibaldi in the French troops, at various times in the streets of the Vatican, and we certainly see it in the Civil War. We also see it with Eisenhower sending in not just National Guard, but federal actual military troops into the South. And the one thing that Professor Burke doesn't explicitly touch on in the paper is you just saw it with the New Deal and the concentration of enormous power under the authority of FDR in the American context. So this is a real, as Professor Parker said, crisis. And so I guess the force of my question is, yes, these papers have beautifully showed two things. One, that claims of infallibility in the late 19th and 20th century are generally made by people in positions of decreasing power. So it's a symptom of powerlessness. And two, that the claims of infallibility only worsen the situation of powerlessness. So we've sort of shown that these claims are ineffectual and sort of a bad idea, kind of both normatively and practically. But then sort of the question arises, are there resources in any of these traditions for constraining what has precipitated the crisis? And here maybe this is sort of something Professor Kaplan was pointing to in his first comment to Professor Burke's paper. On the one hand, you can look at the 20th century American situation and say the Supreme Court has gone way out of line in sort of asserting this impossible to enforce infallibility. On the other hand, you see the unbelievable seizure of legal power by the executive. And so there seem to be two problems, right? One is these claims of infallibility by impotent judges. The other is the inability of law to constrain incredibly powerful executives. So how does one balance this critique of infallibility by pointing to some resources within these traditions for actually solving the problem?
I'd just like to make a point historically. Peter Kenrick, the leader of the minority bishops, was very conscious of these sorts of issues. I mean, he was an archbishop in a divided city. St. Louis was forced to stay in the Union by a German militia, German-American militia, and in letters post-Civil War, as they approached the prospect of the council, Peter Kenrick wrote to other bishops in America saying, I think the over-centralization of the church in church and state is a bad idea. So he's very conscious of this political connection. I think the balance of power is in part what seems to be a theme that these various traditions seem to be struggling with and around. Can there be some kind of balancing of this authority that leaders can use by persuasion? And that seems to me, as a Roman Catholic theologian, to be one of the real crises for not only the papacy, but also for the bishops in the wave after wave of clerical sexual abuse crises around the world. And the realization that it was really a moral failing of our leadership to protect the weakest and the most vulnerable. So, the issue of moral persuasion that I think Professor Burt has talked about really stands out in my mind as being one of the great needs in the tradition that I represent.
It's a huge question, Jeremy, that you have raised, and let me just briefly respond. I agree with you that there's a terrible problem that we have not begun to come to grips with about the huge growth of irresponsible executive authority. And the worst place for that, in my view, is in the war-making powers. And the courts have been almost supine in turning to the president. He wants it. What do we know? In my view, their presentational sense of themselves as infallible and requiring immediate obedience, it's like they only have one weapon at their disposal, and it's a nuclear weapon. And they are being sensible, modest people, you know, and the president says, well, I have the secret source of information and, you know, all of this stuff. And it seems to me a sensible person is kind of modest in being prepared to say, well, I don't care, you know, what you say, that the country will fall apart. You've got to stop this. So what the courts should be doing is looking for mediating interventions, particularly trying to enlist Congress and bolstering congressional authority over the war-making power, without them being, as it were, the last word. It's their claim to be the last word that in this context, the most important context, I think, at the moment, for unchecked authority, kind of cripples them.
Well, I think with that, we're done. Thank you very much.
Well, this was fun.
Good, yeah, very nice.
I didn't have to use my 5-minute warning.
Oh, okay. No one, huh?